What's up, fucker? It's your boy Slacky Jack. Fights Gone By podcast coming at you on Thursday the 3rd of September. And we're talking about, lots of stuff today because, there was an event, and as you can tell, I wasn't particularly blown away by it. I didn't feel the rush to talk, to come back and talk to you about it. But we'll touch on it today. There were a couple of things that stood out. And then there's a card this weekend, which is garbage. And it looks to be that way for a few weeks now. We are very much, certainly the UFC, very much only in it for the money. The ESPN, they've got a certain number of dates they have to fill with ESPN. And the whole next 3 weeks of cards has an overwhelming feeling of, I'm just here so I don't get fined. It's like, who's got a pulse that we can throw on this card? So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some news, some movings and shakings in the divisions. I'm going to get angry about Masvidal versus Diaz. And then we're going to talk about some matchmaking. We're going to do some fantasy matchmaking, dream matchmaking, whatever you want to call it, my matchmaking. The fights I think would be compelling in some of the UFC's, the UFC divisions that matter, so bantamweight to middleweight men. Because, if they're not putting anyone good on these cards, they've got all these people, some of them they're not going to be able to get to the fights, but certainly there's a lot of people around. What better time to do fantasy matchmaking? That's what I'm saying. But before we go into that, let's talk about the card from last weekend, which was Rakic versus Smith. And it was a bit depressing, because in the main event you had Anthony Smith. Basically, he got low kicked a few times by, a monstrously hard low kicker, no doubt. But it just followed that pattern of Anthony Smith starts losing, goes to the turtle. And he's pretty decent at defending himself from the turtle, but Rakic just flattened him out in half guard, and neither man did anything. There was Rakic would have some success, and then he'd just hold him down, which is not how you win fans, not how you impress anyone, especially if you then jump up with 10 seconds to go in the last round and run around the ring celebrating for a fight where you haven't really impressed that much. But ultimately, and I said this afterwards, I think it's time for Anthony Smith to be shipped off to the greener pastures of Bellator and become maybe the best light heavyweight in the world over there. Rakic, obviously pretty exciting that we got someone new in the light heavyweight division. I mean, is it exciting? Maybe not. But good stuff from this card. Before we talk about Robbie Lawler and get depressed again, let's talk about some good stuff. I liked Alexa Grasso's boxing in this one. She was fighting. She looked a little bit like a female Masvidal, actually. Very high hands. Was working the jab and the lead leg. The jab, it's interesting because it's easier to jab with your fist pointing at the opponent. It was Sugar Ray Robinson said that one of the most useful bits of advice he got was from some guy called Captain something or other. Some old dude in a Detroit gym said, look in the mirror, do your shadowboxing in front of the mirror, and make sure you can always see down the barrel of your gun. Which is why Robinson always carried his hands a little bit lower. Hide behind the lead shoulder, use your head movement, but he carried his hands a little bit lower so that he could throw them straight at the opponent. Whereas if you have your hands very high, the barrels of your guns, in this metaphor, are pointing upwards. So jabbing well off your own head to the opponent's head is quite tricky to do, but I thought Grasso did it well. Masvidal does it well, that was why I made the comparison. She was doing jabbing into the lead leg, step-up low kick, which worked nicely. She did a couple to the body as well, threw some right low kicks to the legs, uncorked the right hand occasionally. If I had to say something about her, I'd say I would love to see her work her left hook better, just find it better, because she was scoring points, she was landing the odd hard shot on, I can't remember the name of her opponent, the other lass, and then the other lass would come back and she'd sort of slide away, or she'd duck in and throw a right hand and then slide away, and you're like, that's the perfect time to be coming up with the left hook. Catch her when she thinks she's initiating the action and she's in control. But she managed to not get taken down, not get squished against the fence, and to win a decision, which is good, because Grasso is one of those ones where here's another comparison to Masvidal for you. She'll do well in a fight and you'll go, I think she's getting better, and then she might lose anyway, just on decision. So yeah, good on Alexa Grasso. Fight of the night was Ricardo Llamas versus Bill Algeo. Obviously, we're all bummed out that we didn't get Ryan Hall versus Ricardo Llamas, but Bill Algeo stepped in, did some interesting stuff. Obviously, completely different type of fighter to Ryan Hall. Not a jiu-jitsu savant. Really seemed more to be, very tall, rangy guy looking to shoot left straights from southpaw and just do that weird outside point fighty stuff. hit Llamas with a beautiful knee right on the snout as Llamas was stepping in, and I think that was round 1 or round 2. Llamas' striking has always been meh, so he was getting too confident there. But rounds 2 and 3, he really got to his grappling more, and he's just a very fun grappler. Like if you watch a Ricardo Llamas fight, you're gonna see some good grappling if he grapples. You're gonna see some mediocre stand up if he stands up. But in celebration of that, I re-uploaded the Filthy Casuals guide to Freak Guards, which was Ricardo Llamas and Mansour Barnui. And then basically this card, well, I won £14 on this card by parlaying a load of fights to go to decision and Rakic to win a decision. But mainly because I was like, Anthony Smith, fairly tough. Didn't start losing that Glover Teixeira fight until late in the 3rd round. This one is a 3-round main event. It's probably going the distance, and I don't reckon that Anthony Smith's winning. That was the only real bit of deduction I made on this card. And then I said, Grasso versus Kim, they'll go to decision. Magny versus Lawler will go to decision. All that stuff. And I managed to win £14 on like a £3 bet. So that was good fun. But also, the fights weren't. But the first 4 fights of the night were all finishes, including Alex Caceres beating up some lad. So yeah, honestly, if you haven't seen it, not worth your time. But let's talk about some fights that I really would like to see. And we're not going to talk like X versus the champion, Y versus the champion, Z versus the champion. We're going to talk about some interesting fights in the middle of the, well, not in the middle of the division, the ranked guys. So cream of the crop in your weight class. But this is following up on news that we're getting Kamaru Usman versus Gilbert Burns. That match has been re-signed. And then there is a lot of talk about Diaz versus Masvidal 2, which only appeals to the absolute stupidest people in the world. Are these Diaz fans paying for pay-per-views? Why are we pandering to them so hard? I don't know. But if they did renegotiate Masvidal's contract to get that short notice title fight, I imagine they're like, if we're paying him this much money, we don't want to do it for, half the views versus Leon Edwards when we could have him have an easy win versus Diaz again and build up another title fight or some shit. Does leave Leon Edwards in the middle of nowhere. He's going to be well, they're talking about him versus Stephen Thompson at the time of recording, which again, lower ranked opponent, rough fight, plenty of chance to lose, and he doesn't get any of the big bucks from the rivalry with Masvidal. But that's plenty of moaning, Jack. What do you want to see? Well, let's start with the UFC's lightweight division, the Shark Tank of MMA. This is where everything happens, where one loss sets you back a decade in your hunt for a title fight. And the lightweight division is just sort of all over the place at the moment. You've got Justin Gaethje challenging for the title. You've got Conor McGregor, always a presence, could just pop back in at any time and fuck everything up. You've got Dustin Poirier versus Tony Ferguson, fair enough. But really interesting is sort of like the up-and-coming guys, the guys who are sort of heralded further. The real heads know. And particularly 4 dudes in a sort of round robin I would love to see. Makhachev, Ferreira, Dariush, Oliveira. And it rhymes too. But any combination of those 4 men is like the most compelling thing you could do at lightweight right now for me. The downside is, or the sad part is, that Makhachev has just signed a fight with Rafael dos Anjos, one that makes very little sense, on that Khabib versus Gaethje card, as part of the 2 Dagestanis who are getting showcase matchups on that. But Makhachev versus Ferreira is particularly interesting to me because Ferreira is all-out aggression nowadays, moves forward, puts incredible pace and volume on his opponent, and he stops a mean takedown. If you saw him against Rustam Havilov, just moved him back, Havilov kept shooting, Ferreira kept going nah, or getting up, and then just kept the pressure on him and melted him. Same thing against Mairbek Taisumov, different type of fighter, huge banger. Ferreira just walks him down, no issues. Southpaw jabbing, orthodox jabbing, putting the volume on him. He's a fantastically interesting fighter. And then he did the same to Anthony Pettis, who is, more than Taisumov and Havilov. Pettis is allergic to pressure. So he just mauled him there. And I really wanted to put out a little Filthy Casuals quickie on that because in the moment that they're saying Ferreira's idol is Jacare, he does the Jacare peel off the fence, which is where you get the over-under to take the back. And you put one hook in on the side away from the fence, and then you bring your fence side leg up to put it, basically leg press at the same height, off the fence at the same height as the opponent's shoulder, and just throw yourself back into the middle of the mat. Jacare did it several times against Bristol Marunde, and Ferreira did it several times against Anthony Pettis. And I'd just quite like to see Makhachev under pressure in that sort of way. Obviously, he had that amazing high-paced fight with Arman Sarukian, but a lot of the time he likes to control the distance or be on the lead. You don't get to see him backed up a lot, and I think that would be the compelling part of the Ferreira matchup. Sub in Charles Oliveira, who I'm doing a big piece of work on. Well, I'm going to be publishing it immediately after this, so if you're a Patreon boy, go read that. But Charles Oliveira, if you sub him in instead of Ferreira, you have Oliveira versus Makhachev. Equally compelling fight. If you saw Oliveira versus Kevin Lee, probably the performance of his life, backed Lee up, lifted him out of his stance with front kicks, jabbed him a few times, but it countered the jab by either slipping inside it or palming it and catching the collar tie. And then he'd combination punch out of the collar tie instead of using his jab and going jab for jab with Lee, which is obviously what Gregor Gillespie did and got drawn into a counter. Again, going to talk. I am writing currently today about that particular fight in an absolute masterclass piece. So, Patreon boys, be on the lookout. But I think that also matches up well with Makhachev. But I could see Makhachev getting on the back foot. I could see Oliveira losing on the bottom because I've seen him. He's amazing from bottom half. He's good from the guard. But even closed guard is just not a position that you're going to beat world class people in typically. And Makhachev, all those Dagestanis who keep their head low, just grind into you on the mat. Very hard to submit. The other thing about Oliveira is that he excels with the guillotine, does really well by front kicking or head kicking and letting the guy catch the leg and chasing the guillotine, chasing the takedown, and he'll snap up the guillotine from there. That's how he finished Lee. I think that's how he got Lentz the third time, or did he TKO Lentz? He's guillotined a fair few people, but he also goes for the guillotine when the guy is pursuing double leg and he's got both legs under him and he'll just get folded over to full guard. But in the striking, you tend to see Makhachev work at a more measured pace. He's not sort of Habib-style character who just sort of bobbles his head and then lunges in. Makhachev has always been regarded as like the more clean, technical striker of the two. The thing that all the Russophile MMA fans say is like, oh, the better rounded guy, he's the better technician, Makhachev. And then Dariush, again, offers another interesting challenge in that very good pressure fighter, very good. Well, he's better pursuing takedowns than Oliveira and Ferreira. Great body kicks, decent jab, amazing left hand. Getting hit more nowadays. Like, you can see him becoming a little bit more defensively porous, but going to his wrestling more too. Now, Ferreira versus Oliveira would be magic, but no one would pay attention to it, which is a real shame. You need Makhachev there to get the nerds in. Another big name coming up at lightweight is Drew Dober, putting on the run of his life. Just knocked out Alexander Hernandez, Nasrat Haqparast, and Polo Reyes before that. Him versus Dariush. Now, that sounds like an entertaining fight on paper, but that could be an absolute mess because you got both guys, love being the southpaw, love all the looks that being a southpaw gives them against an orthodox fighter. It could just get really messy. For some fun, you could give Dober Leonardo Santos, who is a monster, but also kind of an absentee fighter. And his last one, he did gas out hard after an amazing first round. Jiu-Jitsu savant, really getting better with the striking. Not, the wrestling, not as much a threat as it could be. I think if you wanted to just snuff Dober's hype out, you'd get the returning Gregor Gillespie to fight him and just stick to him for 3 rounds. But Dober versus Moicano could be a lot of fun. A couple of guys just going to come out and kick the shit out of each other's arms and legs. Actually, looking down these rankings, there's a couple here that are just sort of, I suppose are on extended hiatus. I believe Kevin Lee's taken some time off. Ali Akinta is around, but hasn't won in forever. Lost to Donald Cerrone, lost to Dan Hooker, beat Kevin Lee a little while back, but aside from that, done nothing for years. Ali Akinta versus Diego Ferreira would be an interesting one to get, possibly get Ali Akinta back on his feet, but also that gives you Diego Ferreira's most compelling matchup. People who are going to try and take him down, but will get tired doing so. And Paul Felder's still popping around. I mean, he's in the top 10 according to the UFC's official. I think he's number 7 in the UFC official rankings. So well regarded, but I still think of him as like the middle division, like middle of the top. There's guys who go cream of the crop, and then there's guys who go not quite there yet. I still consider Felder like alongside those sort of guys. So Felder Makhachev could be good. I mean, that's a good name to get on Makhachev's record. Felder Lee to get Lee back in the win column. I'm just thinking like on the other hand, like Felder stops a good takedown, and I've always said better as like a brawler than a striker. His footwork really lets him down. And he when he does do what he does well is hit really hard, especially while holding people. So really good ground and pound, great clinch strikes. But he insists on like trying spinning back kicks and stuff out in the open where he's just quite slow. Though he's focusing on his commentary gig, which might be the worst matchup that the UFC's ever made. As you get further down the division, you still, a lot of really good guys still like down in the 20s and 30s. Again, we're switching over to different ranking sites now because the UFC doesn't rank below 15 or 16 because they have the champion plus number one. But you've got Trinaldo, who's on a great little run, just knocked out Jai Herbert in the worst stoppage of all time, and Brad Riddle, who everyone's super hype on, as well as Bobby Green, who, after years of not enjoying watching Bobby Green, I'm now a big Bobby Green fan. Then you got Rafael Fiziev, just arrived, plus Sarukian, who's just got his second win back-to-back after debuting short notice, I think it was, against Islam Makhachev. Sarukian versus Santos would be a smart one, because I could see Sarukian giving Santos a horrible time, because he's very hard to take down, very hard to keep down, and if Santos came in the shape, or even close to the shape that he did for his last one, I could see Sarukian just lighting him up with spin kicks and head kick attempts in the second and third round. Question is, like, how much of a scalp is that for Arman Sarukian? I don't believe, Arman Sarukian would probably fight him, be like, yeah, I'll take that fight, but are you getting anything out of that, And that's the situation that Santos has worked himself into, Leonardo Santos. He is a very dangerous fighter, hasn't lost in forever, big wins over people like Kevin Lee, but he fights so rarely and is so little known that you get nothing from fighting him. It's like Francisco Trinaldo, is again on a great run, but old, doesn't speak English, not going to bring in anyone who's not already like a super hardcore fan, and very tricky. Why would you fight him? But, okay, I've had a quick think, and I've narrowed it down to 5 that I want to see, or would want to see, and I've kind of done it in a couple of them are ones I really want to see. A couple of them are obviously Benil Dariush versus Charles Oliveira at the moment is looking like an actual fight, so I'm not going to have that in there. But I've done ones that make me ask a lot of questions, because I think the most compelling fights, for me at least, are the ones where I can see it going a lot of different ways, or there's one key issue where I just have no idea how they match up. So here they are, some weird ones. Obviously Diego Ferreira versus Islam Makhachev, because I want to see if Makhachev can deal with the pressure, if Ferreira can deal with the takedowns, how Makhachev's ring craft is against someone who wants to cut the cage constantly. I think that is like the most interesting fight at lightweight for me right now, with the exception of like title fights, but well, maybe even that. But my next one's sort of a cheat, because I'm trying to keep them roughly, where they deserve to be in rankings, or close enough so that you'll move up if you win. However, I think that Paul Felder's pretty overranked right now, based on decisions over James Vick and Edson Barboza. James Vick's no longer around, and Edson Barboza's gone down to featherweight. But I wanted to give him an interesting fight, and 2 of the ones that I thought of were Benil Dariush, because I think Benil Dariush, I think a lot of people would regard Felder as the better striker, but I think Benil Dariush could give him a lot of problems with his speed and movement on the feet. But a lot of what Dariush has been able to bring is also the threat of the takedown, pushing people onto the fence. Especially in his recent ones, he's really relied on that quite a lot. And Felder is very tricky to take down, very strong in the clinch. And this is where I've cheated a bit, because I've given Paul Felder 2 different matchups here. I also think it'd be very interesting to see him against Gregor Gillespie, who needs a fight coming back. Obviously, massive difference in the rankings there, but Paul Felder probably not getting a title shot. Might as well just take fights for fight's sake. And then you get that interesting situation where I believe that Paul Felder could probably give Gregor Gillespie trouble getting him down early, but would he be able to use elbows, knees, head posts to effectively hurt Gillespie, or would Gillespie just stick to him for 3 rounds? Matchup 3 or 4, depending on how you want to consider this, but I went for 2 criminally underrated boys who no one really watches. I'm going to put them against each other so that we don't have to bother the casual fans. Leonardo Santos and Francisco Trinaldo, obviously problems for anyone in the division, but their problems are that they can't get fights. And I think in that you've got, well, basically both of them are old men now. Santos has been around forever, but Santos I would consider the faster, probably less feeling the effects of his age, but Trinaldo, strong, tricky, fantastic at timing his left hand over the top of orthodox fighters' right straights. The power to sleep anyone at lightweight, pretty much. Amazing also operating a grindy game. He could just push you to the fence, use outside trips. To be honest, he could probably stop Santos taking him down, but keep him in the clinch and make a really boring fight of it if he wanted to. But I think that's a compelling matchup. Two guys with great skill sets, and no one loves them. And then for number 5 or 4, depending on how we're counting this, the final one, I went Drew Dober versus Arman Tsarukyan, because Tsarukyan obviously very strong wrestler, but also a bit of a wild man on the feet. Dober, you don't want to put him in against someone who's just going to blanket him right away when he's got this amazing knockout run going on. But Tsarukyan provides a test in the wrestling while also a fun fight on the feet. He's also a decent enough name that you would respect it if Dober got the win, and obviously Dober is a huge leap up in the rankings if Tsarukyan beats him. I said I was going to do every weight class, but that actually took forever. I think really the point I want to get across today is that Diego Ferreira is awesome, and I haven't given Charles Oliveira a matchup in this because I just did. The problem with Oliveira now is that he's beaten a really good guy in Kevin Lee. Kevin Lee and El Iaquinta are just sort of sitting there in the rankings quite high up, but we don't know if they're coming back. Same with Felder, actually. He could well just commentate from now on. But it's hard to find Oliveira a matchup that makes sense aside from that Dariush one. Maybe Hooker. Hooker would be a fun fight. But anyway, there's 5 good matchups that the UFC can steal, and I won't even blame them. I don't think there's much point looking at this card this weekend. Really the only things that are happening are Augusto Sakai versus Overeem. Augusto Sakai really only answers the question, what if Anderson Braddock Silva but MMA? He's like Junior Albini. Where are they finding all these fat Brazilian kickboxers to come over to MMA? And Overeem, is always going to be one of the best technicians at heavyweight. He's always going to be enormous and strong, and he's always going to have trouble taking shots on the chin. But he is paid the price of a house every time he fights, so yeah, don't expect him to retire anytime soon. So let's do some questions, which are a little bit more interesting. This is one I got a week or two ago, and I actually thought it was quite interesting, and I should touch on it. Hi Jack, big fan here from Belgium. I just saw they uploaded Conor versus Holloway as a free fight on YouTube. I would love for you to include that in a future Slacky's film room. But that aside, do you also cover KSW? From what I understand, the next main event, Gamrot versus Musayev, is supposed to be pretty good. Do you have any thoughts on that? Listening to your podcast and reading your articles have already brought me a long way in better understanding MMA, so thanks a lot. Kind regards from Max. Conor vs. Holloway film room, I'll have a look, see if it's still up, and then I have been planning to do another film room. I just haven't found the fights I want to do yet. But KSW, good question. Do I cover KSW? I don't consciously not cover KSW. I think that's the thing. It's like Rising. I try to keep up, but it's tricky if you're an English speaker. And at some of the, that's the thing with Rising, KSW, even Bellator. There are some really good fighters there. And they also have lots of not great fighters, and you have to sort of pick through. But Gamrot has always been on my radar because he fought 2 very good grapplers in MMA. Kleber Koike Herbst and the boy himself, Mansour Barnoui, and he beat both of them. He's undefeated against good opposition, or as good as you'll find outside the UFC. And last ADCC, he went to the last ADCC, had a good match with Gary Tonin. I think he might have had Tonin in the first round and went out, but I do remember him holding his own against Gary Tonin, who went on to medal. So Gamrot, legit, if you've never seen him fight, can be a little slow, not as amazing on the feet as he is on the ground, but definitely worth your time. Musayev I was not as familiar with. I think I saw him fight Fight Nights Global back in the day. I'll check his record now. He actually hasn't done much since then. He's fought twice in KSW, finished both his opponents, but again, another undefeated fighter. And this is where it gets tricky, because he's also an undefeated fighter, and he's got 3 fights less than Gamrot. Yeah, Gamrot's 16-0, Musayev's 13-0. But I'm always harping on about how you can't obsess about records in MMA. When Rashad Evans and Lyoto Machida fought, and that was the first undefeated versus undefeated fight for a title in the UFC, that was incredible. But it was incredible because you knew the context of the stat. You're like, well, both these guys have fought really good guys, and they're still undefeated. Whereas now there's a lot of wanking over the idea that the current crop of UFC champions have the best combined record of any crop of UFC champions ever, or something like that. And you're like, no, don't obsess with that because then we'll get boxing. Because looking at, you don't have to go. Gamrot, I know that Kleber Koika Herbst is good. I know that Norman Park is decent. I know that Mansour Barnoui is very good. But with Shamil Musayev, don't have to go far down his record. Like his last fight in Fight Nights Global, which is the one that I remember seeing, and he knocked his dude out. He was 11-0 versus a 4-5 opponent. 2 fights before that, he was 9-0 against a 0-0-0 opponent, and before that, 8-0 versus a 0-0-0 opponent, 7-0 versus a 0-0-0 opponent. Little bit concerning, but equally, Habib had a lot of fights like that too. And that's the thing with covering people outside the UFC. You have to try and keep up with who's decent, so that you know how good the really good guy that they're pushing is. But I would recommend you watch Gamrot versus Barnoui, because that's good fun. And versus Kleber Koika Herbst, too. I don't know what Herbst is up to at the moment, actually, because he was a really promising lad. I was doing a prospect watch piece on him, and I just never finished it. But yes, I don't consciously not cover KSW. In fact, I like covering KSW because they're really good about media. They have been quite open about, like, if you want to do a Filthy Casuals guide, we'll give you the footage. We'll give you the best quality footage we have. And we're never, they're never going to claim it on YouTube, which is really nice. So like the Roberto Soldic one, I did that because Roberto Soldic is really good, and KSW were cool about me using the footage so it can just stay up there. But equally, they do a lot of those like bodybuilder who made a diss track on Polish YouTube against another bodybuilder who made a diss track on Polish YouTube. So yeah, it's a bit weird. It's like 2 different promotions. Anyway, cheers, Max. Hi, Jack. Is there any discernible difference in skill between a pro boxer and an amateur? And in terms of boxing ability, are the best MMA boxers equivalent to absolute cans in the boxing world, as the black coffee and craft beer drinking fellas on Our Boxing would lead you to believe? From Scott. Well, before we go into any of these, it's still a fist fight. Like, that's the thing about boxing. It can go horribly wrong even if you're giving guys squish matches. Because that's what the knockout does. If your local team plays AC Milan, there's 90 minutes for them to fix any minor fuck up where they concede a goal. If you're in a boxing match, a minor fuck up can, lead you to be laid out. With that being said, there are obviously levels. I hate that expression, levels to this. But the difference between pro and amateur is a really interesting one to sort of get stuck into, because there are some very prestigious prizes in amateur boxing, and of course those also lead into a pro career. For the first part, getting an Olympic medal really helps you get you a promotional boost when you turn pro. And for quite a lot of people, quite a lot of the time, the idea was go to the Olympic trials, go to the Olympics, try and win the Olympics, go pro. And you saw that with a lot of heavyweights back in the day. There wasn't a lot of incentive to keep going back to the Olympics, which is why it was it's quite strange when someone like Lomachenko competed at 2 Olympiads, and Rigondeaux did the same thing. They only happen every 4 years, but that's a good chunk of your athletic life that you've taken out not earning any money. Because the big thing about amateur versus pro, they might have changed this. I haven't watched amateur boxing in a little while. I know they changed the rules on headgear and everyone was happy about that. But the big rule for a very long time was that if you have a professional boxing license, you can't then go back to the amateurs. And I don't think that's the case in most other Olympic sports, because you had the basketball, you can have the dream team just rock up, but that's asking people to make big decisions. You are a good enough boxer that you could be earning money doing this, or you could stay broke for, let's have a look at the calendar, when's the next Olympics. And you'll read biographies, and like certain heavyweights will just be like, they were going to try for the Olympics, they got injured, they went pro instead, things like that. But on the other hand, like if you're not super promising from an early age, you might not end up in the amateur boxing system with teams, and you go pro early, and you might turn out much better. Mexico especially, guys go pro very early. You got extremes on both ends. You got the Lomachenkos with 400 amateur fights, and then you got guys who took no amateur fights and went pro immediately. And I think that's the thing, that it's treated like it's a natural progression when really they're 2 different sort of things. And then amateur versus pro in terms of rule set and like game as a game itself is pretty interesting too, because when you talk about someone like if you ever get talking about Felix Savon or Teofilio Stevenson, they were very, very promising. They were heavyweight champions at the Olympics multiple times, and they never went professional because Cuba didn't have professional sports. And they happened to coincide with Stevenson. They wanted him to fight Ali, and Savon, there's a good book called In the Red Corner, where some guy goes down to Cuba to try and negotiate a fight between Savon and Mike Tyson. And whenever you get into talking about those sort of things, you have to weigh up their actual physical potential. Maybe Teofilio Stevenson was good enough to beat, or was a good enough boxer that he could have beaten Ali and Savon Tyson. But you've also got to remember they basically, when you compare the professional game to the amateur game, those guys were boxing with training wheels, basically. And the changes have been different over time. Like, Stevenson was in the Olympics without headgear, but Savon was in the Olympics with headgear. Headgear is obviously a difference. But the main one is number of rounds. It's a much longer stretch, especially if you're talking about guys going straight into a title fight like they wanted to do with Stevenson and Savon. It's a lot. You're moving from like a middle distance race to a long distance race. It's a big step up. And judging, of course. I don't know what the judging is like in amateur boxing now. Well, probably shite, but I don't know how they do it at the moment. But they used to do it by scoring punches. So, like, the judges had to press a button when they saw a punch connect. And it was an electronic system at the London Olympics, at least. But it would, like, register if multiple judges pressed it at the same time. And there's a really interesting book called, I can't even remember what it's called. It might be like The Ultimate Boxer or something. Something lame sounding. But it was by the coach of the women's boxing team, the US women's boxing team. And there's a whole chapter on, like, judging layouts. There'll either be 3 judges or 5 judges, and they'll be sat here, here, and here. If you want to take a breather, stand in this bit of the ring. If you want to score some points, move them to this bit of the ring. And you're like, fucking hell, it really is a different game. Whereas judging in professional boxing is more on your feelies. You're not counting punches. You're going, ooh, who did I feel won that round? Which you would think leaves more opportunity for corruption, but like the scoring on some of those amateur bouts where they scored punch for punch was just all over the place. So really, like, yes, the logical progression is from amateur to pro, but if it were legal to be a professional and then go amateur, good pros would not necessarily be the best amateurs in the world. And on the subject of MMA fighters, like, everyone always brings up Clay Collard because he's always doing decently, competing in both boxing as a professional and MMA as a professional. Yeah, I mean, he's not. I don't believe he's getting toward top flight opponents at the moment, but he's certainly doing decently against journeymen in boxing. I think, like, if you look at MMA boxing or boxing in MMA and you expect it to look like boxing in boxing, I think we have to accept that it's not gonna, because if you could kick Floyd Mayweather in the leg every time he jabbed, he'd be shit at boxing too. It's a completely different game. It really is. And you've got to take elements of it and apply them. You can't just slap it on 1 for 1, which, anyone who watches it for more than 10 minutes will probably understand. That's not to excuse the lack of quality punching technique and strategy and tactics from a lot of MMA fighters. That's just to say that, like, there are guys who are getting good at applying boxing in MMA, but even then, it's what you can apply. It's not boxing. Cheers, Scott. I just realised that I forgot to say Gamrot versus Masayev actually fell through. Masayev injured his knee. Gamrot fought Zolkowski and won. But yeah, they'll probably rebook that match at some point. Just in case you're going to go looking for when that's happening. Hey Jack, how would you consider improving Weidman's game if we are to consider that he won't be retiring for a while? I think this is a good question, actually. I think, well, honestly, like, what I like to do is to try and find tactical shifts, tactical changes or strategic changes that guys can make to make better use of what they've got. I think if you're talking about a long-term career path for Weidman from now, I think you've got to consider, like, cardio has to be the biggest thing. He's already a brilliant technician in most areas of the game. Guys should just be conditioning all the time, specifically like wrestling conditioning, being able to do that for 3 to 5 rounds. And I think you've got to convince him to drop the first round. Not even necessarily drop the first round. I think you've got to convince him to do nothing for the first round. Because first round Weidman is a monster, typically. With the exception of like the Reyes fight. It actually wasn't great in the most recent one. He came on late, which was very strange for Weidman. But, the number of fights, like the Musashi one's a great example, the Jacare one, where he comes out looking really sharp and then he loses because in the second and third rounds, he slows down and he starts to fall apart and you can see him falling apart both physically and mentally. I think it would be great to see him Thinking like Bernard Hopkins when he was fighting at 55 or whatever. But the older he got, the less he did. And you get this reputation for being a defensive fighter, and then if nothing happens, you win that round. But Weidman could just take the first round off and then start over from the second round. Do what he does in the first round, take it to the second round. If he could do that, that'd be amazing. Obviously, a little bit harder with someone in your face concerning you. But with how easily he ragdolls some of these dudes in the first round, I think it'd be easier for him to take a step back and just use that strength if he needs to keep people off him. I would like to see him move to a more hand-fighty style. He jabs a lot and he carries his hands quite low a lot of the time. I think I'd like to see him move to like a more traditional Muay Thai Muay Thai style, but like fight the hands, check the hands, throw the low kicks, because he's got good low kicks, as Anderson Silva will attest. He's got good folding elbows, as he did against Mark Munoz. But I think the obsession with boxing and then not being able to move his head once he gets tired and not being able to defend himself properly really hurts him. I also think, like, any time we're talking about fighters getting older, I think dirty boxing is the secret to aging successfully in this sport, or aging gracefully. You won't, but more gracefully. I think that's the secret, because anytime you can push a guy to the fence and land blows when he can't, you are at an advantage, even if you're just chipping away at him. Think Big Nog's last few fights. Now, Weidman has the massive advantage over someone like Big Nog, or Fabio Maldonado used to do it in the UFC too, but he's got the advantage of actually being a very strong wrestler. And doing decent hitting from the single collar tie. Well, I mean, we could mention the Anderson Silva one again, but, Anderson Silva's chin was pretty shot at the time. But dirty boxing is an area where it can make an enormous difference in a fight, and it's still really underused in MMA. I was said the other week I could count on my nuts the number of guys who clinch strike well and consistently in MMA. I'd like to add an addendum, a third nut, if you will. Charles Oliveira. The more I watch him, the more I see him entering clinches, using the single collar tie effectively. And I think Weidman could benefit enormously from that. You hit well, your problems are on the defensive end, get a hold of the guy and just wail on him. I think pursuing takedowns is far more tiring. I think he should be working on the upright clinch, faking takedowns, taking them if they come easy, but then just coming back up on the underhook if he can't, if he meets resistance. Why fuck around trying to be the stronger man in the cage when, it's going to make you fade in round 3? Conditioning and self-preservation, both like his health and his stamina through the fight, should be the top concerns for Chris Weidman and for his team. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today. As I've plugged several times today, Charles Oliveira, absolute masterclass, coming probably a couple of hours after this goes up. If you want to support the podcast and get in on that stuff, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. I hope these fights are all right, like surprisingly good over the weekend. We got Sijara Eubanks, and she's always good fun. And we'll be back on Monday to talk about what happened. We've actually got some more interesting stuff coming next week. There's 2 Bellator events with quite a few notable fights on them, and a UFC card. So hopefully it picks up a bit. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Do Bronx bless.